In this video, we look at the structure of sentences in an Old English document that is considered to be the earliest example of the written form of the language. In particular, we will look at the role of Parataxis when writing and speaking in Old English. Alright, so here's an image representing Pope Gregory's envoy to the Anglo-Saxon King Ethelbert in 597. Seeking permission to bring the faith to the Anglo-Saxon peoples, and King Ethelbert accepted that, and the rest is history. So that delegation arrived in 597, and we're going to be looking today at King Ethelbert's laws. He reigned somewhere between 560 and 616, and we're going to look at his laws established or written, recorded in about 600 AD. So they're thought to be the earliest written example of Old English. Now, prior to the coming of the Christians, Anglo-Saxon culture was not a written, recorded culture. It was an oral culture. It was the Christians who brought literacy, reading, writing, because of the emphasis they placed upon studying God's word in the form of the Bible. Now, in pre-Christian times, the Anglo-Saxons recorded their history, their stories, their laws orally, and transmitted them orally and recorded them in memory. There was no writing down of these laws. And so we're going to look at the beginning of King Ethelbert's law code in this video, and we're going to look at the sentence structure within it. But let me just set the scene here. So here's Pope Gregory's envoy, St. Augustine, bringing the Christian faith to the Anglo-Saxon peoples. This strange new faith that these pagan peoples had heard of, but was totally, almost completely unknown to them otherwise. They'd heard of it because across the sea in Francia, amongst the Franks, they'd already been converted. All right. Now, an independent clause can stand as a sentence on its own. All right. And when we talk about a clause, it has at least a subject and a verb, and can have other elements. So an independent clause in Old English has the conjugated verb in the second place. All Germanic languages have a verb in the second place. They all share that. We've seen that in previous videos. And just to remind you, the content of this slide here just comes from the previous videos in this series. So we have subject, we have verb, then we can have things like the object, direct object, time, manner, place, reason, even indirect object as well. I just didn't have the room here to necessarily go through it, and I don't need to. So here's the general structure. Now these can change place. For instance, we may want to emphasize the manner in which something occurred. And so in our sentence, we can place the manner first. But that means the subject is then shifted to third place because the verb must always remain in the second place. Like all Germanic languages, Old English and Modern English are a verb second language. And so that pushes, in this case here, if we want to emphasize the manner by placing that first, the subject is then shifted from first place over here to third place, okay, displacing everything else along the way. Okay, so we may, for instance, want to emphasize the place in which something occurred. So we place place out front, the location where it occurred, then the verb, subject, and everything else. We may want to emphasize reason, again the same thing, the reason out front, then the verb, the conjugated verb, and subject, and so on. Okay. Again, the object, the direct object, we may want to emphasize that, place that out front, verb, subject, and all the rest. Okay, and that's all the subject of, this is just revision of content from previous videos. But even within this sentence structure here, these things here, time, manner, place, reason, object, they can all be moved about. Okay, they can be shifted. So we can have subject, verb, we could have time instead of object, we could place the object over here. We're free to move these things. What really matters is that the verb is in second place. The conjugated verb is in the second place. That's the first verb in a sentence. There could be other verbs in a sentence, and we'll see what happens to those. Okay, now, when there are two or more verbs are present, they go to the end of the sentence in their infinitive form. So here we have subject, verb, time, indirect object, object, okay? The second verb goes to the very end in its infinitive form, its unconjugated form. If there's another verb, a third verb, that then goes into the second last place and you build inwards if you like. Okay, now that's all been covered in the previous videos in this series, so please do have a look at those. An independent or main clause can be joined, independent or main clauses, sorry, can be joined together by coordinating conjunctions. Whole video on that earlier on in this list. I can't remember if it was number 3 or 4, forget which it was. Okay, which dealt with coordinating conjunctions only. Coordinating conjunctions do not change the word order in main clauses. So we have a main clause. We want to string 2 main clauses together. We use a coordinating conjunction and but. Okay. Uck for but. So we have, say, I like bread, but I like cheese more. Okay, they're 2 independent clauses. Each clause can stand as a sentence in its own right. I like bread is a distinct whole sentence. I like cheese more. That's a distinct sentence. Both of those can stand separately on their own as a complete sentence in their own right. And all we need is a coordinating conjunction to join those 2 sentences together, or 2 clauses together. So, ich licie bread, ak ich licie cheese ma. Okay? And we use a coordinating conjunction for that. Whole separate video on coordinating conjunctions, number 3 or 4 in the playlist. All right, now let's come to subordinate clauses or dependent clauses. Now, a subordinate or dependent clause is joined to a main clause by a subordinating conjunction. So here's an example here. The meaning that or on which, or the generally meaning which. Okay, but its meaning can vary a bit depending on the circumstance. So here we have a main clause. He did it on the same day. And now we just want to add some more information, and we attach a dependent clause. This is a clause that can't stand as a sentence in its own right. It provides extra information to the main clause. So it's dependent upon the main clause, and we need a subordinating conjunction to join an independent clause, this first part, to the independent clause. Now, I apologise if I'm labouring the point to people who already understand this topic very well, but I just need to be clear because I have people of all different interests and backgrounds and abilities watching this video, so I need to cater for everyone. Okay, so let's have a look at it. He did it on the same day, that or on which they him to the funeral pyre to bear intended. So he's done something on a day on which a group of people intended to bear the dead person to the funeral pyre. Okay, so he doet hit stu ilkandaya the he hinne to tham aarde bearen woldon. Okay, so there marks the beginning of a subordinating conjunction, and the subordinating conjunction is this one. Okay, they him to the funeral pyre to bear intended. So they intended to bear him to the funeral pyre. Okay, and when you convert that into the subordinate clause, you don't forget to put all the verbs at the end. Okay, and that's the important thing about subordinating conjunctions is they do alter the word order in dependent clauses by pushing the verbs to the end of the clause. And again, that's video 5, I think it is, on the playlist, 5 and 6, and I'll show how the verbs are pushed to the end of the clause. Now, we can also alter the order of grammatical objects in the subordinate clause, except for the verbs that must remain at the end. That's the key thing. The verbs remain at the end. The first verb in this subordinate clause goes to the very end in its conjugated form, and all other verbs are in their infinitive or unconjugated form, and they go in the second last position. And if there was a third verb, it would go in the third last position, and so on. Okay, so now we can alter within this subordinate clause. Now, just on the next slide, I want to look at what can happen within this subordinate clause. We're not going to change anything in the main clause or the independent clause. We're just going to alter the order of some of these objects. The thing we will not alter in both these examples here is the verbs remain at the end. The first verb goes to the very end in its conjugated form. The second verb, if there's a second verb in the dependent clause will go into the second last place in its infinitive form. So here we are now. Instead of having the subject first, we've placed him, the dead person who's going to be taken to the funeral pyre. Okay, so we place that object because we want to emphasize that object, him, the dead person, they to the funeral pyre to bear intended. Okay, let's say we wanted to emphasize the funeral pyre within the dependent clause. Okay, then we place that first, then the subject, then the object. Okay, depends. I mean, so in this particular case here, it's the funeral pyre that we particularly wanted to emphasize. Remember, the subordinate or dependent clause is adding information to the main clause. And when we come to that dependent clause, we just want to emphasize within it the funeral pyre in this particular case. Up here, we wanted to emphasize the dead person. Okay? And in the previous slide, we wanted to emphasize the people around who were carrying the dead person. Okay? So within the subordinate clause, we can vary things, the order of things, the order of various grammatical objects, but not the verbs. That structure remains. Verb last is a signature feature of dependent clauses in Old English and in other Germanic languages too. Now, the law code of the first Christian king of Kent, who converted, Athelbert, died in 616. He ruled from 560 to 616, is both the first piece of English law and the earliest datable work composed in Old English. I should have put there. So he was king of Kent between 560 and 616 AD. So very quite early. And the copy we have today is found in a document known as Textus Refensis. It was compiled in the 12th century, the earlier part of the 12th century. This image here I've taken from the British Library collection, and I will put the link, hopefully try to remember to put the link in the video description below this video, the link to this document. Okay, now within this document, because I want to look at sentence structure now, I'm going to focus particularly on this first part here down to about law number 12. I think it was law number 12, or it was 11. I think it's 12. Anyway, so again from the British Library, here's our collection. I've just zoomed in on this part, and it's the sentence structure within this part. Now, when you look at this and everything that we do from now on, just remember this is a written account of Athelbert's laws. But in Athelbert's time, the first Christian delegation arrives from Pope Gregory in 597. Around that time and prior to that time, this was an oral culture. And so this list reads as though it's something that is read out in a public place and is committed to memory by those at that gathering. Remember, it is an oral culture. It is not a written culture until the church settles in amongst the Anglo-Saxons and starts developing literacy and training local people in the Latin language and elsewhere. So up to this time, right now, King Athelbert's time, vast majority of people are illiterate. Maybe there might be an odd example here or two of one of the king's members of court or a couple of individuals who may be literate in some sort of language other than Old English, probably literate in Latin or some of the languages, so they can communicate with people on the mainland of Europe and with Rome and elsewhere. But other than that, everyone was illiterate. Okay, and so this list reads as though it's a list that is delivered verbally and committed to memory. So we're listening to how people speak. So when we go through this list, we're reading how people would be speaking in that time. We're listening to them speaking. Okay. Now the bit up red here, maybe I've read some of this might be put in later and not from that period, but the bit in red may have been written at a later period. Okay, but certainly this bit here, you can imagine yourselves in 600 AD, when this was written down by perhaps the first Christian scribe. You can imagine that this is how the language sounded. This is how people were speaking. When important information had to be conveyed in a meeting, in an open air assembly somewhere, it had to be clear, it had to be concise, it had to be able to be committed to memory. And so you often find when you read through this, you'll notice it's a bit terse, it's a bit direct, it's not flowery language, it's something that's easy to commit to memory in that era where everything was oral and memory based. So you can imagine our ancestors speaking. You can hear them. Okay. And it's wonderfully to the point, terse, brief, exact, complete. It's fantastic to listen to. Okay, so we have, for instance, when I start with Goddess Ferch and Chirachen 12 Yulde. Okay, now the number 7 here, that Arabic 7 symbol here, is actually an ampersand. It actually stands for and. Okay, so whenever you see that's an abbreviation for the word and. Okay, notice the numerals here for 12 is not spelt out. You don't see the Old English word 12th there, but you can read it as 12th. All right, so Goddess Ferch and Chirache and 12 Yulde. Okay, so of God's wealth and the churches, 12 times compensation. So this is a list of laws of what is to happen if the various crimes listed here are committed. So someone interferes with the church's property. Property could be anything, buildings, food, possessions, individuals, anything. It's whatever God's property and the church's property was not to be touched. And if it was infringed anyway, then this is saying 12-fold compensation must be paid to the church. This is the king laying down the law. There will be, for whatever is taken from God's property or from the churches, which means the churches, whatever is taken, 12 times compensation, 12-fold restitution must be made. Okay? Of the bishop's wealth, the bishop has Ferch and Leven Yulde. Of the bishop's wealth, 11 times restitution or compensation must be paid. Okay? Parataxis Ferch Nichon Yulde. So for a priest's property, 9-fold restitution or compensation is required. And so on, the list goes down here. And we'll have a look at each of these shortly, okay? I'm going to go through the sentence structure here. Wonderfully terse and to the point. So bishop's property is touched, then compensation of 11 times is required. So if you take a shilling from the bishop, then you're going to be paying 11 shillings back. It's going to cost you dearly. So do not do it. Okay, let's have a look at these now. All right, so I'm going to list these. Goddess Ferch and Chirachen 12 Yulde. Okay, so of God's property and of the churches, 12-fold compensation. Bishop is Ferch and 11 Yulde. Of the bishop's property, 11-fold compensation. Parataxis Ferch Nichon Yulde. So of the priest's property, 9-fold compensation. So don't touch the priest's property. You'll be paying for it 9 times over. Diaconess Ferch Siex Yulde. So of the deacon's property, 6-fold compensation. Okay. Clerices Ferch Tharia Yulde. So of a cleric's property, 3-fold compensation. So if you took a pig worth 10 shillings from a cleric, then you'll be paying 30 shillings back to the cleric. So not very huge disincentive to touch any church property. Okay, remember the church was very new to Anglo-Saxon to the Anglo-Saxon people. It was a totally strange new belief system. So King Ethelbert was smart. He needed to set laws to protect the church, because the church were going to be strangers amongst the Anglo-Saxons. Thousands of years of different beliefs. They'd never seen anything like this Christian faith. Okay, and he was asking very different things of them. And so it was likely there would be a bit of friction, there would be some rejection, there would possibly be some conflict. And so the king has anticipated this with these laws. Where am I now? Diaconess Ferch Six Yulda, so 6-fold compensation. I've done cleric. Chirach Frith Tway Yulda. Twa Yulde, right? Taway and Yulde. So right of church sanctuary, twofold compensation. So if the church provided sanctuary, I mean, what happens is that if there were a conflict between parties, a feud, one party could seek sanctuary if it was being chased by another party, could seek sanctuary in the church, and that right of church sanctuary could not be interfered with by anyone. Otherwise, they'll be paying twofold compensation for doing so. So it's not, again, disincentive. Germanic laws are about trying to keep the peace between people. If you read through the laws, there's all kinds of punishments for everything from murder, violence, rape, all kinds of stuff, theft, all the rest of it. So they're about maintaining peace. And all Germanic societies had its laws, and they're all passed down verbally and so on. And we're seeing an example of this. This was being passed down at the time verbally because people were not literate at this time. The church had only just arrived. Okay, so right. Interfering with the right of church sanctuary, twofold compensation. Mathel Ferrith Taway and Yulda, or Twa Yulda. Security of a public assembly, twofold compensation. So what it's saying is assemblies were necessary for people to meet. Last thing they want is feuds and violence and theft and all the rest to break out. They had to deal with it. Okay, so you violate the security of a public assembly, you're going to be paying for it. All right. Okay, let's have a look. Here we go. Yif kuning his leerde to him je hateth, and her monthar uvel yedo toa bota, and kuning 50 shillinga. Okay, so you can imagine that just being read out in an assembly somewhere. He's laying down the law. If the king his people to him calls, so the king calls his people to them, and to them one person their evil does, twofold compensation. And to the king, 50 shillings. All right, now, yif is a subordinating conjunction. Okay, so we can expect as a subordinating conjunction, the verb will be sent to last place in the clause. And that is exactly what has happened. Yahateth has gone to the very end. In its conjugated form, it's gone to the very end. So we've got the conjunction, subordinating conjunction, yif. Then we have subject, object, indirect object, and the verb in last place. Okay. And then we have a coordinating conjunction here. So we're joining a clause of equal grammatical weight. So this is also a subordinate clause. We know that too because not only is this joining a clause of equal grammatical weight, but we also have the verb at the very end. All right. You do, meaning past tense does. Past tense of do, so does. Okay. So Yif Kuning his leode to him je hateth, and her mon thar uvel je do toa bota, and Kuninga 50 shillinga. Okay, now here there's a comma, and there's this toa bota in here, another comma, and then here we have a coordinating conjunction. Here's another subordinate clause in here. Okay, there's no noun involved, all right, but we have Kuninger is in the indirect object, so hence the green for that, indirect object. Schillinger is in the genitive, so it's to the king of 50 shillings, so this is in the genitive because it's the property of the king. The king will get 50 shillings, but the twofold compensation here will go to the people here who've been harmed. I believe that's what's intended here. Okay, so you notice that now what I'm going to be looking at here is this business where all of a sudden there's this to and bolter. Okay, so bolter is compensation for wrongdoing. Okay, now notice that this is not the nominative form of bolter is bolt. Okay, bolter with the E on it can be accusative, it could be genitive, and it can be dative. All right, so which one is it? It's probably just accusative. It's just an object. But what's happening between this comma and this comma is something called parataxis. And I'm going to make that the focus shortly of the video. We're coming to that shortly. I'll get into it. But it's an example of parataxis, okay, where there's no coordinating conjunction involved, but it still functions in practice as a subordinate clause, even though it's not marked out with a subordinating conjunction such as if, okay, or any conjunction for that matter. Okay, here we have a conjunction, then we're adding on this object here. We have the indirect object and the genitive. Okay, but so let's deal a little bit with coordinating conjunctions. Okay, so between the two commas, this is an example of parataxis. Okay, I just need to make you aware of it. I'm not producing an excessively academic channel here. I'm not getting into grammar. I'm not going overboard with that. I want to try and make this as simple as possible for everyone. I want to make this, I'm not interested in anything theoretical, academic, and so on like that. But if we just make you aware of something called parataxis, so that when things like this pop up, there's a comma, couple of words, okay, comma, and then moves on again. It really is a subordinate clause. Okay, so anyway, parataxis is a technique used in writing or speaking involving short and simple sentences that do not use conjunctions, so they're asyndetic, or that use a coordinating but not subordinating conjunction, so that's syndetic. Now notice up here there's no conjunctions of any kind, okay, so this is asyndetic. So examples include, so then, what is happening here? Okay, so then, comma, what is happening here? So we still use it in modern English, but it was more common in Old English than it is in modern. And I came, I saw, I conquered, Julius Caesar. Notice here just I came, comma, I saw, comma, I conquered. Notice there's nothing called, it doesn't say I came and I saw and I conquered. Okay, nothing like that, just no conjunctions whatsoever, just commas. Okay, but there's still a subordinate clause in effect. Okay. The opposite of parataxis is hypertaxis. Hypertaxis or hypertaxis is the use of subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns to connect dependent elements to the main clause. That's been the subject of all the previous videos. Wherever we've done conjunctions, coordinating and subordinating, that's hypertaxis. Okay. At least, sorry, for subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns. So though, what's that in this series? That's videos 5 and 6, I think it is. 4, 5, and 6. Okay. Now, parataxis is common in Old English. So I'm just drawing your attention to it, making a bit of a fuss about it, just so that you're not troubled by it. It is a subordinating clause. Okay. So there are a couple of things to note about parataxis. Paratactic clauses don't have a grammatically expressed object. There's no expressed subject. My apologies. Paratactic clauses don't have a grammatically expressed subject. So you notice up here, toi, bota, so twofold compensation. There's no subject here. There's nothing in the nominative here. Okay. They are subordinate to the clause that precedes them. Okay, even though they lack a subordinating conjunction. So this twofold compensation is a terse, clear, minimalist way of saying twofold compensation for everything that followed here, where this one individual did evil to a group of people who had gathered in the king's name. Okay, that's the consequence for it. Okay, they explain the motive or give the result for the clause to which they are subordinate. So here, twofold compensation was a consequence of what this individual here did to this group of people who had been called together in the name of the king. Okay, so terse, to the point, clear, minimal amount of words, no subject, nothing. It is a subordinate clause and it is the consequence. Okay. They explain the motive or give the result for the clause to which they are subordinate. Okay, so toi bota, twofold compensation, is a consequence of everything that followed in the previous clause. Okay, an example of that, he sat on tham muntum, way up and herpode. Okay, he sat on the mountains, comma, weeping and harping. So weeping and harping was an explanation for why he sat on the mountains. Okay, it explains what has happened in the previous clause. Now, given the above, we can interpret the phrase toi bota, toi and bota, as twofold compensation is due for the harm done by the individual in the preceding clause. Okay, yif kuning at manus harm the rinkath and tharaman luswas hawat yado toi bota yabeta. Okay, now, so here we go. Yif kuning at manus harm the rinkath and tharman luswas hawat yado tui bota yabeta. Okay, so if the king at someone's home drinks, so the king's drinking at someone's home, subordinate clause, so the verb must go to the end. That's why it sounds funny to us. If the king at someone's home drinks. Whereas we would say, if the king drinks at someone's home. But because it's a subordinate clause, we'd have to take the verb out of the second place after the subject and stick it at the very end because it's a subordinate clause in the Old English. Okay, whereas in modern English, we'd put drinks after the king. The king drinks at someone's home. Okay, but okay, according to these rules for a subordinate clause, the verb must go to the end. Now we join a clause of equal weight, equal grammatical weight, and tharman luswas hawatido. So another subordinate clause is joined. We know it's subordinate because the verb has gone to the very end. So there a person of evil at all does. Now, what that means is there's a person there who's done any... So if there is a person there who has done any kind of evil at all, okay, then this consequence will follow. So, okay, so all that's saying is tharman luswas, there a person of evil at all does, or of evil any does, right, or does any evil. So if we were to translate it into modern English, it would be there a person does any evil at all, okay, then this will follow. So again, we have our comma and Parataxis takes over again, and we have tui bota yabeta, okay, twofold compensation, okay, to atone for. Okay, notice here verb is in the last position. In this two-word clause is a subordinate phrase, I should say, because there's no subject. There's a verb, but no subject. Tui bota is not in the nominative. Okay, so twofold compensation to atone for. So this is a subordinate clause. This comma, it is a subordinate clause, and it just goes on the end. Terse, to the point. Okay, so you've got a king at a person's home drinking, and if someone there does any kind of evil whatsoever, then they're going to be paying twofold compensation to atone for it. That's what all of this is saying here, and that's how we'd express it in modern English. So if the king is drinking at someone's home and there a person does any kind of evil at all, twofold compensation must they pay to atone for it. All right? So Parataxis, where you see that comma, something like that, there's no subject, okay, you've got a verb at the end, then you've got a subordinate clause. That's all it is. It acts as a subordinate clause, even though it's not formally dressed up as one, because with a subordinate clause, you expect there to be a subordinating conjunction, such as if or many of those other words that we've covered in the previous video. But there isn't one. It just goes straight into it. Only the comma is an indication to you that Parataxis is at work. All right. Yifariman kuning satella nihon yulda far yulda. Ooh. Yulda. So here we go again. Parataxis again. Yulda far yulda. Blimey. So we've got two verbs here. And we'll see what that is in a minute. So in modern English, we could write, if a freeman steals from the king, should pay to atone for it ninefold compensation. He or whatever the freeman should pay to atone for it ninefold compensation. So yifariman kuninga satella nihon yulder far yulder. Okay, if a freeman from the king steals, comma, ninefold compensation should pay to atone for it. All right. So here, subordinating conjunction, a subject, indirect object. We know this indirect object's got an E on the end, so it's in a dative. First verb is conjugated, satella, okay. First person, present tense, steals, okay. Then this, by the way, this compensation, this is actually in the subjunctive. I haven't mentioned that, but these yulders here are in the subjunctive, okay. They're expressing an intention. It's not necessarily an established fact. It's an intention, an expectation, an expression of what's expected. Okay, so it goes, this verb is in the subjunctive. So is this one here, farulde. Okay, now this one says ninefold compensation. This one says should pay to atone for it. So this has really hammered home the point, because this is about compensation to pay for an error. Yulda is compensation. The numeral out front tells you how many times, so 9 times compensation for wrongdoing. And that's saying, that's then hammering the point home, this next verb, should pay to atone for it. Okay, so this would really be, in modern English, we would write this as the verb first, should pay to atone for it, ninefold compensation. He should pay to atone for it, ninefold compensation, or he should pay to atone for his actions with ninefold compensation. Okay, so translating that to Old English, we would take the first verb, should pay to atone for it, would go in the last place in its conjugated form, and then the next verb would go in its unconjugated form. But here it's also conjugated as well, so it's pressing home the point, ninefold compensation. Okay, law number 11. Jifin kuningas tuna man mannen ofsaleia 50 shil je beta. The shil there, it in the dictionaries, it's shilling. Apparently, this is just written shil and meant to represent plural 50 shillings. Okay, so maybe it was understood at that time that simply saying 50 shil meant 50 shillings, but in this particular case, either the scribe hasn't finished off putting the plural ending here, INGA, but has INGAS, and instead has simply just put 50 shil. Maybe they ran out of space. Maybe in that era it was understood to mean shillings. I don't know. I just noticed that. It was just an odd thing I've noticed. Yebeta is a verb, okay, to atone for. Okay, if a person slays someone in the king's dwelling, 50 shillings to atone for it. Okay, notice that terse. You can imagine this being read aloud. If a person slays someone in the king's dwelling, pause, 50 shillings to atone for it. You can see how that's easier to commit to memory than some wordy multiple sentence structure. Okay, very short to the point, because these must be committed to memory, and there's an awful lot of them. I forget how many were, 80 or something laws or whatever when you go through the list. So I'm just doing the first 11 or 12 here. Okay, if a person slays someone in the king's dwelling, 50 shillings to atone for it. Okay, as that terse, to the point, exact, minimal use of words. Okay, Jifin kuningas tuna man mannen ofsleia 50 shil je beta. Okay, you can imagine that being read out and committed to memory. What we have here, subordinating conjunction yif, the genitive in kuningas, in the king's, tuna, dwelling. This is placed because it's in the dative. Okay, the E on the end marks it's in the dative, so it's a place, in the king's place, in the king's dwelling. Man, that's the subject, that's this individual is going to commit a crime, whoever they are. They're the subject, and the object is the person upon whom the crime is committed. That's someone who's slayed. The verb is slay. Notice the verb at the very end, as you would with subordinate clause, comma, and then the outcome of that. This is parataxis at work. No direct grammatical subject expressed here, but just an outcome explaining what's happened due to the previous clause. All right. All right, and then finally you can imagine a gathering, how it must have looked in those times. The church knew here, at least the early years of the church, approaching the king, the king's retainers around him to protect the king. It's a very important person.